it.
All right, Dr. Soberone, I really enjoyed your talk, and I especially appreciate that you're trying to figure out how to incorporate genetics and genetic variability and evolution into distribution models. I think that's been a real shortcoming of a lot of the future climate models. Have you been able to operationalize it and actually implement it to look at how distributions might change given the genetic variability, evolvability?
That is one of the most theoretical things that we have done, and many of the parameters in those equations are difficult to measure. You need to know parameters that define what is called the mating kernel. You need to know parameters about population dynamics. You need to know a lot of parameters that probably are not easy to obtain. However, I mean, without taking into account evolution, you are still using the Kansas model, and probably we need to go further. So no, we don't have the parameters. Once you have the equations and you start understanding them, perhaps we can find ways of approximating some of them, or getting parameters for one particular situation or a fortunate species that has been studied well enough. But no, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem.
A number of speakers have talked about the importance of considering abundance whenever you're using richness-based estimators, and those can be applied in many cases to establishing conservation priorities. I'd just like to hear some speculation about how a more appropriate treatment of richness taking into consideration abundance might affect conservation priorities based on establishing protected areas, prioritization of emphasis of research, conservation investment.
There's somebody who'd like to start us off?
Well, in some senses, it's an impossible question to answer, in part because one would have to distinguish, I think, between whether the detection of a few number of individuals meant that a few number of individuals were resident in a place, or in fact, if they were transitory. And I think that's the deeper biological question, is what does that number represent in terms of the persistence of the species rather than the snapshot in time when some individuals were there. So I think the more appropriate question is actually trying to distinguish which numbers represent source and sink populations and how that has some long-term effects. Otherwise, you're sort of left, I think, with sort of some operational definition. I mean, we can make any data we want binary, 0 and non-zero. I mean, 0 means absent, everything else is present. We could say 5 and everything above it is present. So we can take those arbitrary decisions and maybe begin to get sort of probability fields of what areas you would include based upon those numbers, but they would have to be informed by odd ecological information about what 5 means. And so that's the hard part. So that's my 2 cents anyways.
A couple of quick thoughts on that. So I think at the species level, there are important aspects of that in both absolute and relative terms. So obviously with the red list criteria, both absolutely small population and change in population are important, and so I think reflection of population level data is clearly a sort of major driver of species level applications to conservation. In terms of relationships between abundance with more community level metrics, which were touched on in several of the talks today, I guess one aspect which I think is quite important, and maybe there's quite a lot of more space for exploration, is relationships not just with alpha diversity that we've heard quite a lot about today, but also with beta diversity. A number of the speakers kind of concluded highlighting the importance of turnover of range size of beta diversity in various ways. And I suspect that now that there are both good metrics available and increasingly good data available to apply these kind of techniques to not just to richness but also to turnover, I think we're going to see some interesting steps forward there over coming years.
Yeah, maybe to address your point, more from a kind of basic ecological point of view than the conservation is, that's, of course, the crux of meta-communities. How much about what we see at a local community, the abundance of species and which species are there, are truly the processes going on at that local site versus, like Mike said, sort of sink dynamics, how many species are there simply because they're being dispersed from the larger regional species pool. And I think that's a fundamental place we are in ecology, is how much does what we see at a local site depend on something about the regional dynamics as well.
One of the, I'm very much always thinking of where the data would come from. And abundance data is difficult to get. And some of the examples that we were shown this morning use data compiled by amateurs or by people that are not really professional scientists. I think that's a very interesting and encouraging trend that more normal public people are beginning to provide abundance data in the form of observations. And here it's basically the birds, which is so abundant, but there are also things related to phenology of flowering and others where people are contributing. The UK is probably the champion on that because they track by citizen force practically everything, including tardigrades, which is really amazing. But they do. So that sort of trend, I think, should be encouraged in any way possible so the public at large begin contributing more this abundance data, which is so crucial and so difficult to obtain.
Hello. Thank you all for being here. It's really cool to have you all. My question has to do with, I guess, the general approach to conservation. It seems to be the sort of green agenda rather than the brown agenda, sort of typical of the global north. That you want to just sort of, conserve, like set it aside and try to protect it from, the destructive humans. But how? To what extent is the question asked whether it's possible to live in a way that isn't catastrophic or that is even, healthy and fulfilling? In this world that it's, as ecologists, I think we probably see more and more that it's connected. You really can't take humans out of the equation. So to what extent is that question asked, or is that sort of a hands-off issue? I mean, I heard recently of a field that's come up called conservation psychology. It's really interesting. So is that something that you see as a potential for cross-discipline collaboration, or does this keep you up at night?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I would make the distinction, I think, as follows, and it shows that it's a distinction. I think there's a gradient of approaches to it. That science tells us what alternate worlds could look like, but human values tell us the ones we choose. So I think any decision, like when I review papers, that conservation should do something. Well, that's a human value. What it should or shouldn't do, that's a human value that's outside the domain per se of the biophysical sciences. The social sciences tell you how humans value those instruments. Of course, understanding what the alternatives look like should inform your decisions, and so proper education and communication informs that valuation. But frankly, it's what people think about those things that ultimately drives the decisions of what to do. And I think it's kind of important to separate the valuation from the alternate possible universes, fully understanding the consequences of those alternate possible universes to human welfare and well-being, but the valuation of that, whether you want to give up your car to have one of my species of bats there, a very personal decision that you might make that's different than what I would make, and would be certainly different than what my mom and dad would have made. And that's the double-edged sword, because as biologists, I think we all want people to believe what we think. You know, we want them to value biodiversity the way we do. And I think that's a valid point, but that's our socio-ecological point of view about biodiversity that's different for other people. So I think there's also a danger of imposing our views on other people. So I think keeping that information somewhat clean and separate is important, although we can't separate it all in what we individually do, but that's okay too.
I would like to complement that a little bit. I think that it's increasingly clear that without radical changes in the way we live, the world is not sustainable. Our societies are not sustainable. The world doesn't give a fig about what we do or don't do. In 10 million years, there's going to be, again, a very nice natural planet without us. Who cares? The planet has survived meteorites, changes in the composition of the atmosphere, collisions of the continents. We are a little piece of sand in the shoe of Gaia. But we have to, our societies, in order to survive, have to change. And I think those are the challenges. How do we produce food for all of us without destroying the seas, the fields, without polluting everything, without depleting aquifers the way we're doing? Big challenge. How to produce food for 10 billion persons? How do we produce energy? How to produce water without doing what we are doing, which is unsustainable? And those are the big questions. Fortunately, they are being addressed by there are papers already estimating what kinds of changes in agriculture should be performed. Of course, if you look outside the industrialized countries, there are many examples of things that are done correctly, mostly by traditional peoples. And the challenge is, how do you amplify those practices that are sustainable but not very productive to turn them into sustainable and productive? But people are doing this since the 70s or probably before. Again, very sort of pioneer works in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Marathi, never read by the Anglo community, and now they're being rediscovered. So I think that your question is very good. We need to change what we do, not only to conserve, but to produce and to live in ways that are not so, that do not have this huge impact that we have. When or why that is going to happen, I don't know, because that's a question of the sociologists. What make us people as a species or as societies to behave the way we behave? Big question, but there is research already taking place, which is very encouraging, and I can lead you to some of the literature if you are interested.
Dr. Brooks?
Yeah, a couple of quick additional thoughts from me on this. As regards green relative to brown agendas, so it's actually astonishing realizing the degree to which the kind of data and tools that we've been talked about today are actually applied not so much in making good things happen or the kind of green agenda, but in the brown agenda. So, for example, the Red List of Threatened Species is the key underpinning tool for Performance Standard 6 of the International Finance Corporation, driving $100 billion of investment worldwide towards helping to make impacts less damaging, as opposed to making good things happen. On your point about protected areas and approaches that are sort of more exclusionary relative to integrative, I think it's really important to recognise. I guess I mentioned this point this morning. The fact that there are a wide range of sort of new models of protected area governance that are emerging, looking at ways of structuring protected area governance. Sure, absolutely, with sort of central government, federal, national parks and things, but also to look at models led by the private sector, led by indigenous communities, local communities, land trusts. And then third, on your point on conservation psychology, I think there are some interesting connections from that to what Jorge was just saying about the potential for public engagement in biodiversity science per se. I see that Cannabio has actually just established an agreement with, is it iNaturalist, I think, one of the major sort of platforms for crowdsourcing biodiversity data collection, which I agree is a really exciting new development.
I just wanted to add one other point, and that is that in the field of political science as it relates to the environment, obviously concerns about environmental justice are issues, and there's some contemporary movement that suggests that in fact most nations' political systems are ones that essentially regulate, have policies about, or have laws that talk about the distribution of abundance to current populations without any content about future populations. So future born individuals have no rights. They're not born yet. They can't sue in courts. They have no legal standing. And so this guy is, well, his argument is that true sustainability will never be able to be implemented, in fact, until there's explicit recognition in the legal system, which then informs policy decisions, that future generations have rights that have to be weighed with the rights and privileges of contemporary, i.e. extant individuals. So I think it's promising that people are starting to think that way. I don't know where it's going to go, but I think it clearly addresses, I think, the question of how do you balance the stuff that we distribute. I mean, we can't distribute it fairly now, frankly, among the people that exist. So it's a really tremendous problem, but it's good to see that social scientists are beginning to grapple with this issue and think about ways that it would be incorporated into decision-making and that has some legal weight associated with it.
Do the panelists have any more comments? Is there another question?
I have a question and conveniently have a microphone. So Dr. Willig, Mengi, Mittelbach, and Soberone each at some point in your talk discussed about how species respond to an environmental gradient or some ecosystem process. But now a lot of ecologists are starting to flip that relationship over and think about how species impact environmental gradients or impact ecosystem processes. So as I think about that, the independent variable of 2 decades ago is now the dependent variable. And to me that seems a little bit disconcerting. So I wonder how you feel about any approach that looks at only one side of that relationship and doesn't consider feedbacks. And can the results and the conclusions we draw from that have any weight if we're not considering both sides of that relationship, which we know have effects going in both directions?
I'll take a first shot at that, because I've thought about that a lot, because it obviously, species, richness, productivity, I mean, that's a relationship that was looked at from productivity driving species richness, what I talked about today, but obviously all of the experiments that have done biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, look at it the other way around. And it's a big, and that's a good question, which is why. My personal point of view is that if you look at really broad gradients, environmental gradients like I was talking about today, that it's probably the environment that's driving the diversity pattern. And that if you think about on a smaller scale or a more localized environmental scale, or most of those biodiversity ecosystem functioning experiments are done trying to hold everything else constant as you can and vary species richness, how much does that have an effect on productivity? And you see it there. And to me, it's just kind of a question of strength of the effect and rates, and how does that balance out. I agree they're both there. I think it's a bit a matter of scale and how big of an environmental gradient they're looking at.
I'll say something. I thought about that some too. I work in oceans, and so my response to that sort of thinking is that it's hard to envision, except on fairly local scales, what impact the biota would have on ocean conditions. The ocean transports things and so forth that are produced on the shore or produced close to shore kelp beds can modify wave environments, they can modify other things on a local scale, but in terms of the larger scale, I think it still goes the environment to the biota. Is sort of the perspective I have. I think if you scale things properly, scales on land are quite different from what they are in the ocean in a lot of ways. To look at zonation in the intertidal, to do like something equivalent on land, you'd have to look at a mountain. So you've got a much greater distance to look at. I think the organismal size patterns are generally different too. Trees are enormous. There aren't any real equivalents in the ocean. So I think the organismal size scales, spatial scales that exist, maybe if you look at things in the same sort of scale ratios that on land that you do in the ocean, it would still come out that the environment is having the biggest influence on biology.
Please.
One other thought on that is the massive influence of extinction and extirpation filters on current studies of these sorts of relationships. So that's certainly true on land. If you think about the fact that through East and Southeast Asia, nearly all individuals of any species larger than, say, a rabbit are now gone. But I think it's also the case in all sorts of other systems, extinctions of intertidal invertebrates in Australia, green turtles in the Caribbean. I think that our contemporary studies of ecological relationships in very many systems will necessarily be seeing only a subset of the full gradients that existed, say, 500 years ago.
We have time for one more question. In the blue shirt.
I'd like to address an issue that you raised as well, Congressman Campbell. Along this idea of global sustainability, it appears that there seems to be a strong consensus that we need to develop greater linkages between theory and application. So my question is, based on your experience, do you perceive conditions or approaches or academic structures that are more conducive to that kind of activity that we've used in the past? Reading between your comments, it's almost as if you used application to step outside of ecological theory to some extent to sort of reconstruct it. That's my notion. I'd like to hear yours.
I think that's a very interesting question, and before, when I was working still for the government, I couldn't have answered that, but now I have been an academic and I can ask sociology professors what do they think about the conveyor belt between science and policy and things like that. It turns out that there are a number of studies on this and what works better, and it's an excellent question. There are some types of institutions that do this transference of science and theoretical things, or basically science and knowledge, to policy in much better ways than others. They even have a name, which is border institutions, because they are in between science and policy at different levels. So yeah, the answer is there are certain institutions that are better designed or better suited to do this kind of thing. Mostly they have permanence. They're capable of translating from one language to another. They have the capacity to follow up, which is very important. In countries like mine, Congress changes every 3 years, and they cannot be re-elected. So every 3 years you have to start anew, talking with people. An institution that stays have it's very powerful in that sense because they have the capacity to address and readdress and readdress and insist on the same thing for a long period of time. So permanence, capacity to translate, legitimacy, the capacity to involve stakeholders of different types in order to reach solutions that are acceptable. And like, for instance, I mentioned Monsanto and Greenpeace sitting together in the same table looking at ways of dealing with this issue of the transgenics. That took like a year of negotiation, but the result is accepted by both, so that's legitimate in some sense. So these are three core issues. Some institutions do that more or less well. Here in the United States that I have seen, many consulting groups, many NGOs with large, I mean, this morning several were mentioned, Nature Conservancy, Nature Serve, the Fish and Wildlife Service has contacts with very deep, very intimate with many universities. So those institutions, I think, are better suited to do this transfer than just the isolated scientist. Yes, I think, yeah, that kind of approach is very much what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's clearly important. I think, I mean, the evidence, I think, is very strong that until you get the human element involved, there is very little impact of scientific knowledge. It can inform, but it's not necessarily acted on. So I think it's pretty clear that there has to be a partnership there. My only worry is that I don't think it's happening fast enough.
Somebody else like to share their opinion? No? Well, if you could all help me in thanking our panelists for coming.